I also love your decode segments where today you're going to call out the profit motive behind the pharmaceutical industry and how disastrous that is when you're dealing with a worldwide pandemic.
Yes, ma'am. All right. Well, guys, I think it's safe to say that the vaccine rollout in the United States has gone better than expected. I mean, at current rates, the US is on target to vaccinate every adult in the country by May. In fact, according to the New York Times, it's going so well that the Biden administration is facing a new problem: what to do with all the excess vaccines. Now, overall, the 10 richest countries in the world are getting an overwhelming amount of the vaccines.
According to the United Nations, 3/4 of all COVID-19 vaccines have been secured by just 10 countries, all of them wealthy. 130 countries, that's about 2.5 billion people, have not received a single dose.
So the US is going to have too many vaccines very soon, while billions of people in the global south are getting none, which makes the issue of how the rest of the world gets vaccines all the more pressing.
Much has been reported about the unequal access to COVID-19 vaccines around the world. The 10 wealthy nations have secured the majority of supplies. Developing countries say part of the problem is that drug makers are controlling production and they're blocking access to information about how they're made. South Africa, India, and more than 100 nations want the World Trade Organization to waive patent restrictions so they can mass produce the vaccines. Well, that's facing opposition from the United States and some European nations where firms, including Pfizer and AstraZeneca, are based. The global vaccine market is estimated to be worth nearly $60 billion a year.
That's right. While the rich countries hoard vaccines, the poorer countries of the global south are asking them to waive the vaccine's intellectual property restrictions so that they can begin manufacturing the vaccines themselves. But the rich countries are blocking them from being able to do that. To be very clear, they are not asking the rich countries to give them any of their vaccines, because I think it's somewhat understandable that politicians like Joe Biden or other European leaders are hesitant to give them out before they know exactly whether they'll need them for boosters and the like for their own population. You can imagine some sort of furious backlash if for some reason they found themselves in a situation where they've given out vaccines to other countries while their own population needs them. But that is not what the global south is asking for. They're asking the rich countries to waive the intellectual property restrictions on the vaccine so that they can manufacture them themselves. Essentially, all they want is access to the instruction booklet for the vaccine. So why the hell would anyone oppose that? Seems like a pretty reasonable ask, right?
But many high-income countries, including the United States and those in the European Union, have rejected the idea. They say waiving the patents would put off private investors and slow down scientific innovation.
Put off private investors or slow down scientific innovation? If that sounds like a bunch of bullshit to you, it's because it is. What that is, my friends, is a nicer way of saying that the rich countries need to protect the profits of these private companies.
Right, but these companies would also say, Max, that while running these types of companies are expensive and without a profit, they're not going to survive. This is simply their business model that's been around for many, many years.
Yes, they would say that. But I think in this case, I would dispute that, but I would also dispute that particularly in this case, all of the leading vaccine candidates have been hugely funded by public money, by taxpayers' money, and that has covered all of the risks of their investment, all the risks of their production. So it's simply not the case that they've risked lots of their money and they need to recoup those profits. And certainly not the levels of profit that we're seeing from the likes of Pfizer and Moderna, between a 60 and 80% profit margin on a vaccine that was based on research that was publicly supported in Germany. Same for Moderna, publicly supported in the US. It's simply not the case that their business model would collapse. And even if it did, why should we put the business model of this one industry ahead of the survival of humanity? If ever there was a reason to question the defense of intellectual property, it is now, and we have to move fast and we have to vaccinate the world, and these companies are simply not stepping up.
That guy from Oxfam is absolutely right. What the US and European governments are doing is totally insane. They're protecting the profits of a few over the health of billions. But you don't even have to go all kumbaya on this. What the rich countries are doing is stupid, even if you look at it from a purely self-interest way. Because even if everyone in the rich world gets vaccinated, while the virus rages on in poorer nations, that is a major problem for the rich world. For starters, we live in a totally globalized economy these days, so crippling large nations like India has a massive effect on global supply chains and global markets. And with regards to the virus itself, we know that allowing it to ravage a large population leads to mutations which will inevitably come back to haunt the rich vaccinated nations. We've already seen new strains in places like Brazil, and it's not exactly clear whether the vaccine can ward off any and all mutations. But of course, without needing to get conspiratorial, that would mean more profits for pharmaceutical companies. And while the vaccine is free right now for all Americans, and even though a huge chunk of the money for the development of the vaccine came from the government, i.e. the taxpayer, i.e. you and me, the pharmaceutical companies absolutely expect to make a healthy profit off of the vaccine, and they are quite open about that. Here is Pfizer's CFO.
As we move from a pandemic state, from a pandemic situation to an endemic situation, normal market forces, normal market conditions will start to kick in. And factors like efficacy, booster ability, clinical utility will, basically become very important. And we view that as, quite frankly, a significant opportunity for our vaccine from a demand perspective, from a pricing perspective, given the clinical profile of our vaccine. So clearly, more to come here. But we think as this shifts from pandemic to endemic, we think there's an opportunity here for us.
And according to Li Fang at The Intercept, those comments you just heard build on a lengthy explanation of the financials of the vaccine laid out during Pfizer's last quarterly earnings call. During the event, Pfizer executives announced that the company's coronavirus vaccine was projected to bring in $15 billion this year alone from sales, of which $4 billion would be purely profit. The estimate would make the Pfizer coronavirus vaccine, according to observers, one of the highest grossing pharmaceutical products of all time. This is no different from war profiteering. It is actually maybe even more heinous. I mean, there are things that the government could do. They could institute price controls to make sure that there are no profits from a vaccine that everybody needs and was financed by public money. But liberal Bay, Dr. Anthony Fauci, scoffed at the idea.
The private sector has been a good partner and not priced vaccines in a way that had made them unaffordable. Yet there are some who want to impose price controls on the products before they're developed. Would such efforts help or hurt your ability to partner with the private sector in bringing new vaccines to market?
So this is what's called get Tony in trouble question.
Those are the fun ones, aren't they?
Yeah, those are the real fun for you. But then when we're done, it's not so much fun for me. No, I mean, I have a lot of experience over the years dealing with pharmaceutical companies in which we're trying to develop an intervention. And the one thing that is clear is that if you try to enforce things on a company that has multiple different opportunities to do different things, they'll walk away. They will walk away. So as much as you'd like to see fair pricing, I think to force something on a company as opposed to work with them to try and get an understanding, particularly if the federal government helps them in the development of a product for a public health issue, that they will in good faith make it available to those groups, countries, nations that really can't afford it very well. You don't want them to be, I mean, obviously it's a profit-driven industry. You people know that a heck of a lot more than I do because I don't deal in that space. I just deal with the people who deal in that space. And when you're dealing with something that has to have some kind of an economic return, you can't just do something and just give it away. You've got to have some degree of profit. And that has to be taken into consideration.
You gotta love it. Well, to heighten the contradictions between the libs and the left, here we have Senator Bernie Sanders.
Well, I believe that a very good way to demonstrate that American values are back is for the United States to play a leading role in facilitating the production and delivery of these life-saving vaccines and in sharing the innovative technologies for producing them. And that is why today I am sending a letter to the Biden administration to support a proposal to waive vaccine-related intellectual property rights at the World Trade Organization so that we can rapidly expand supplies of vaccines. Ending this pandemic requires collaboration, solidarity, and empathy. It requires a very different mindset, a mindset that puts people over profits at every turn. The pharmaceutical companies must not block this effort, and I join you in your request to temporarily waive WTO intellectual property protections on COVID-19 medical technologies during the pandemic.
Gotta love him. Now, the issue of patent protections in order to bake in profits for life-saving drugs is nothing new. It is a regular occurrence in our capitalist system. The insanity of it is just heightened in moments of genuine crisis like coronavirus, or as Lee Phillips points out in Jacobin, the AIDS crisis. He writes, in the mid-1990s, after the deaths from HIV/AIDS had peaked and begun to decline in the developed world thanks to the discovery of antiretroviral medicines, the HIV/AIDS pandemic continued to cripple South Africa, primarily due to the high cost of the drugs, some $10,000 per year per patient. The newly democratic nation was threatening to produce or import generic drugs to combat the disease, but the pharmaceutical industry was steadfastly opposed, and the Clinton administration, whose healthcare policy was at the time overseen by one Hillary Clinton, threatened Pretoria with trade sanctions. Yes, Queen. In 2001, however, after years of campaigning by groups like South Africa's Treatment Action Group, a militant and science-based AIDS activist organization, and of negotiations by developing nations, the Global South finally managed to win an amendment to the World Trade Organization's Agreement on Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights, or TRIPS, the Doha Declaration, which clarified that governments do not have to respect IP protections during public health emergencies. Large pharmaceutical firms have never been happy with this defeat. Over the years, the United States in particular has attempted to restrict the number of medicines the declaration covers, while most developing countries have insisted that all drugs should count. The defense you hear all the time is that the profit motive is needed to encourage industrious scientists and pharmaceutical companies to take risks to develop new drugs. But this is a canard. Life-saving drugs can and should be squarely in the public domain, because the public sector can make decisions about this based on people's needs, not investor profits. The benefits of public medicine are enormous, and as was pointed out earlier, the public sector already spends huge amounts of money, except right now it does it while then allowing private interests to profit. As Dean Baker writes in Jacobin, quote, take biomedical research. The U.S. is already spending more than $30 billion annually through the National Institutes of Health, well over half of what the entire pharmaceutical industry claims it spends on research every year. The NIH funding is overwhelmingly devoted to basic research, but it has also underwritten the development of drugs and paid for clinical trials. There is no reason why public funding could not be expanded and used to pay for later phases of research and clinical testing. The new drugs could then be sold at generic prices. Now, while the Biden administration blocked a temporary waiver of the so-called trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, or TRIPS, at the last WTO meeting about it, there is another TRIPS meeting in June, and there have been some reports that the rich countries are open to discussing it with the South African and Indian delegations in April, ahead of the meeting. But reporting from Li Fang at The Intercept revealed some pretty stunning financial ties between many of Biden's top administration officials and the pharmaceutical industry. He writes, quote, in the coming months, Linda Thomas Greenfield, President Joe Biden's ambassador to the United Nations, will hear from a growing chorus of developing nations about the foundering efforts to distribute the coronavirus vaccine globally. The nations, many of which have not even begun vaccinating their populations, are demanding that the U.S. support proposals to temporarily waive certain patent and intellectual property rights so that generic coronavirus vaccines can be produced. The proposals have been fiercely opposed by American drug makers, including Pfizer, a pharmaceutical giant that Thomas Greenfield's former consulting firm has recently counted as a client. Thomas Greenfield and her number two, Jeffrey De Laurentiis, previously worked for the Albright Stonebridge Group, or ASG, a consulting firm founded by former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. The firm, which represents Pfizer, specializes in helping large corporations understand the influence of international trade policy, including on intellectual property. Now, it doesn't stop with just the UN ambassador, Linda Thomas Greenfield. there's plenty of other Biden officials who have ties to the pharmaceutical industry. One is Anita Dunn, the leading strategist on Biden's presidential campaign, who now serves as the White House advisor, is on leave from her job as managing partner at the consulting firm she co-founded, SKDK, which provides extensive public relations and advertising services to Pfizer. Dunn intends to return to the SKDK this summer. SKDK, which did not respond to requests for comment, has continued to promote Pfizer's vaccines on social media. Susan Rice, the domestic policy advisor, holds up to $5 million in shares on Johnson & Johnson, and up to $50,000 in shares of Pfizer, according to disclosure made public this week. Eric Lander, the White House advisor, holds up to $1 million in shares in BioNTech, Pfizer's partner for its coronavirus vaccine. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, blah, 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 all of these other people, they all have financial ties to the pharmaceutical industry. Now, this goes to show the nature of the state under capitalism. It is built to protect private profits before anything else. And the ideology of profits as a sort of immutable law of science is so deeply ingrained that even the likes of Dr. Anthony Fauci see it as just some obvious assumption. Challenging it is tantamount to wishing that the sky were green. It's never going to happen. But we must challenge these assumptions. The American state in particular is notorious for outsourcing things that should squarely belong in the public sector, from medicines to weapons manufacturing to even prisons, to private interests. Now, this is really just a way to funnel money away from you and I to a handful of obscenely wealthy investors and shareholders. As Rahm Emanuel said, you shouldn't let a good crisis go to waste. And in a way, the COVID-19 pandemic is an opportunity to expose just how rotten and evil our system is. It is a system that would let billions suffer under a horrible pandemic just to protect the profits of a few.
And Nando, based on the video that you shared of Anthony Fauci, Fauci knows that. And rather than challenge the assumptions that you were talking about, he not only accepts it, but seems to have like disdain for anyone who dare challenge or question it. And it's really important to point that out, as, you know, he's really put on this pedestal as someone who cares about getting the correct information to people so they can protect themselves during the pandemic. Now, while that might be true, the very structure of our healthcare system, the fact that we've commodified pharmaceutical drugs, we've commodified healthcare, is something that, you know, is the main problem in combating this pandemic, and he's unwilling to challenge that. But Fauci is one person. Really, what we see is an entire establishment, an entire political system that continues to make excuses for something that is not just, it's not humane, right? We know that, but it's not even logical, as you pointed out, right? It makes no sense, especially when you're dealing with a global pandemic. And, you know, we keep hearing these news reports about variants. Where do you think the variants come from? It comes from this virus mutating and turning into something that could be far more difficult to treat, far more difficult to vaccinate against. And so, you know, whenever you hear about the logic in a capitalist system, the logic behind commodifying everything and how the market will make the necessary corrections, understand that the logic that they're talking about isn't the logic that looks out for the common good or for the public's interest. It's logic that might lead to more costs. It might lead to more deaths, but it certainly does positively impact the bottom line for these investors and for these executives. That's it. That's the only place the logic lies.
Yeah, the Anthony Fauci clip was pretty stunning to me. I mean, because like here he is, this doctor, scientist guy, pandemic expert, whatever, and he's like weighing in on the economics around the vaccine. I mean, it's something that it just like washes over him like water. It's just he understands it as just this thing that is inevitable. Like, what are you talking about? Like, these people who even like consider any alternatives are just ridiculous. And, you know, I thought it was interesting because this week, Joe Biden gave his first press conference, I guess, or like in a long time or since becoming president or whatever. And like the media,
it was his first,
yeah, his first one. And the media had been like chomping at the bit to like, you know, do their role as like, you know, gatekeepers and holding the powerful accountable and whatever. And they were like making a big stink about Joe Biden not giving any press conferences and blah, 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 blah. So the media finally gets their chance. And did you know that they didn't ask a single question about COVID? Not a single question about COVID was asked. I thought that maybe someone might ask about this, and I was like looking for maybe like how Joe Biden would respond to this idea that the United States is protecting the intellectual property rights of private healthcare companies at the expense of billions of people around the world. And yeah, no one asked about that. No one asked about any COVID related matters. They asked a ton of questions about whether he was going to run again in 2024. It's just like if there was ever any more perfect example of just how awful and stupid and broken political journalism has become in this country, like this case, like where we're living in the middle of a historic crisis, a historic pandemic, and the media has no idea to even ask one question about it.
Right. No, you're right.
It's absolutely crazy.
Yeah. And look, they ask about the horse race because politics for corporate reporters, corporate journalism is nothing more than a blood sport, right? It's nothing more than some reality show drama that they need to immediately start discussing as soon as an election ends, right? They're already focusing on what's going to happen 4 years from now, which is ridiculous. But the other thing that they were talking about or asking incessant questions about had to do with the immigration issue, the fact that you have all these unaccompanied minors showing up to the border, looking to come into the United States. And they kept, the framing of their questions kept trying to goad him into committing to deporting unaccompanied minors. It was kind of amazing. He answered the question a million times. But what I found fascinating is, even with the incessant questioning about immigration, not a single one of them talked about how foreign policy, or asked about how Biden proposes to tackle the crisis through maybe rethinking U.S. foreign policy, right? Because the fact of the matter is he's just engaging in a continuation of the failed U.S. foreign policy that has led to the migrant crisis that we're experiencing at the border right now. I know that's a little bit of a tangent, but I agree with you. The questioning was ridiculous.
Ridiculous. I hate them so much. I hate political journalists so much. They're 99% of them are just awful, truly awful. And there's 1% that are okay, and maybe 0.00001% who are actually good. It's really just such an indictment on our industry, the industry that you and I work in. It's crazy.
Gotta bring that fairness doctrine back. And by the way, a lot of people who watch this show have been asking me for that clip of that segment that I did, which is interesting. I didn't think it would get as much attention as it has, but it's on the Jacobin YouTube channel. Just go through it, you'll see it, and share it far and wide because the corporate media is part of the problem. There's no question.
Yes.
All right. And by the way, share this stream. If you're watching this live, please do that. It's a really great way to help grow the audience for this show and this channel. And, we put a lot of work behind it, a lot of research behind it. And it would be great to get more people to watch and learn about what's really going on behind the scenes with these major issues.